The idea of defecation, the defecation here is kind of an extension of the whole peristalsis thing. Essentially, when fecal matter reaches the rectum, okay, rectum gets distended. Everybody agrees on that? Gets stretched out. That stretch is sensed by this sensory neurons, okay, mechanoreceptors, and they send the signal to the spinal cord. Okay, from the spinal cord there are two ways, sort of. So one is immediate reflex, immediate defecation reflex. When this sensory neurons synapse with the motor neurons, okay, and these motor neurons will stimulate contraction of the smooth muscles in the sigmoid colon, essentially pushing the fecal matter towards the anus, and relaxation of the internal anal sphincter. Does that make sense? At the same time, we know that we want to go to the bathroom. So that knowledge and the further defecation is controlled by the signals from cerebral cortex. So activity that cerebral cortex controls, those activities, are they conscious activities or subconscious? Conscious, right? So that chain of motor neurons control external anal sphincter. And when those muscles are inhibited, sphincter relaxes and the feces are passed. Does that make sense? So you have voluntary and involuntary components. Infants do not develop voluntary component for like 2 years. Okay? Does that make sense? So it is learned, and different kids, it's learned at different age. Okay? Vomiting. Now, vomiting is pretty much breaking up the food. Okay? When it cannot go further, it has to go backwards. And there are several reasons for vomiting. One is obstruction of the digestive tract. Okay? Another one is irritation of the digestive tract, and another is hyperdistension. Now, when we say irritation, example of irritation is when you eat spoiled food or you drink. Alcohol is severe irritant of the stomach epithelium. Okay, it's chemically irritates it, and at certain concentrations it causes vomiting. Another reason for that is the problem with vestibular apparatus, but separate story. Okay, hyperdistension. Look at kids. Sometimes they can't control their cravings. They overeat and they vomit afterwards. Okay, that's classical superdistension. Obstruction of the tract. If obstruction is at the pylorus, and food doesn't go into the duodenum, this causes the acid vomitus. Okay, when you essentially vomit the content of the stomach, and it has an acidic pH. Obstruction lower in the small intestine causes the vomitus that is neutral or basic in pH, because this vomitus also contains the bile and all the contents of the duodenum, which are actually slightly basic. Does that make sense? So that basic content of the duodenum here, of that part, it neutralizes the stolen content. So again, Kim? Oh, no. It's just food. The obstruction is when Kim quite literally cannot move forward. Physically cannot. There is some sort of a spasm here, okay? Or something physically stuck there. Speaking of which, it's really hard to get something stuck unless it's really, really big, like a dime or a quarter. They will go through. You just have to avoid damage, give your child bread. All get covered in bread and will be passed with feces. Now, obstruction here in jejunum, closer to ileum, cause very powerful and vomiting, very extreme in terms of the efforts that you put into it. Lower obstruction will not cause vomiting because it's too much to stimulate, but will cause severe constipation. Okay. Now, how does that work? Let's say there is distension of the stomach. Okay. Descends by a sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic nervous system. Okay. And essentially, those sensory inputs reach medulla, and vomiting centers in the medulla. Medulla oblongata produces the chemicals. Okay, does that make sense? And those chemicals will then stimulate, think about this. First of all, they will stimulate the reverse peristalsis, so the food can get out. It's actually what so all muscle activity will be pretty much like normal, but in the wrong direction. Okay, so food will be peristaltically moved out. At the same time, normally, breath, so you don't lose consciousness because you can't breathe when you vomit. Some people tried, as far as I know, they're dead because vomit ends up in the lungs. Respiratory tract closes, so larynx closes, the epiglottis closes the larynx. Uvula is not very much of a help, as you probably know. It goes through the nose as well as to the mouth. Uvula tries, but the power of vomiting is so huge that it goes through. And people vomit. Okay, now, drugs that stimulate the vomiting center will stimulate the vomiting. Drugs that interfere with the neurotransmitters in a vomiting center will block the vomiting. Antiemetic drugs. Alright? Now, how motion sickness works, I told you before, don't know the exact chemical mechanism, but apparently the signal from vestibular apparatus, when it reaches hypothalamus, okay, this discordance between the fact that your vestibular apparatus senses we're moving and your eyes in the book tell no, we're not, that discordance somehow stimulates the vomiting center in the medulla and people vomit. Yes.
Is that also the same stimulus for just feeling nauseous, like without actually vomiting? Is that the same pathway?
Same chemicals, yes, but probably lower concentrations.
So you don't vomit.
You don't vomit. Yes. You feel sick, but you don't vomit, probably because they don't reach the threshold concentration for vomiting.
So how does that work? Like when you are sick, like is it like the bacteria and stuff is what makes you feel like you're constantly like nauseous with something like that?
Metabolic products of bacteria. Don't ask me about bacteria because I can go on for like 3 hours. For instance, Staph aureus, the microbe that commonly present in the respiratory tract. One of the major causes of food poisoning, with things like anything that contains mayo. Okay, you have an outdoor party, okay, in your backyard, and somebody brings potato salad, and salad stays there, and say it's nice and warm and 75 degrees. Okay, it stays there. Come on, Staph aureus is going to get there, inevitably. Okay, as unless you ask people to like wear surgical gloves and replace the spoon after each bite. It's gonna get there, okay? Now it stays outside, it reproduces, you stick it in the fridge, say it stops reproducing, say it dies. The problem is, it's dead, but toxin that it produces is not. So next day you eat some of that salad, toxin gets to your stomach, it's a toxin, irritates the stomach, you have projectile vomiting and profuse diarrhea for 48 hours and you're good. That's one of the major causes of food poisoning. And that one of my favorite quotes, I heard a question was asked to two microbiologists. How microbiology changed your lifestyle? One of them said, no more mayo-containing products, ever. Ever. It just doesn't eat mayonnaise. Another one said, if that would be up to me, I wouldn't wash my hands after the toilet. I would wash them before. And it makes perfect sense.
Why does mayo have to do with anything?
It's a very good medium for growth. Rich, thick, a lot of carbs, a lot of fats. It's sticky, so they sit there comfortably.
So no one would get sick the day from eating it the day of the party. Wow.
Probably not. Probably not. It has to accumulate the toxin. Does that make sense? And we don't know what is the safe time for it. Maybe it's 2 hours, maybe it's 4 hours. Depends on the temperature too. Now, absorption of water and electrolytes. There's a lot of words there. But the idea, and I will try to put it, so first of all, water is absorbed throughout the entire intestine, mostly in the small, some portion of it in the large. Ions are mostly absorbed in the small intestine. Now, how does the absorption work? Again, it's all about sodium. Look at this. On the basal side, you have sodium-potassium pump. So sodium concentration in a cell is low, right? The pump removes sodium from the columnar cell. Does that make sense? So sodium is then absorbed in the epithelium by the diffusion. Does that make sense? Remember that sodium absorption helps amino acids and carbohydrates to get absorbed as well. That diffusion of sodium is the part of secondary active transport system. Okay? Does that make sense so far? Just think about this. Okay? If we want to picture it, so this is for sodium, so sodium gets, no, it's just, wait a minute. So sodium diffuses from the lumen into the epithelium, but then is pumped from the epithelium to the extracellular fluid / blood. Does that make sense? So this is diffusion. This is primary active transport. Now when sodium is absorbed, what's going to follow sodium? Water. Water is absorbed by osmosis. What's going to happen if you block sodium absorption? What's going to happen? Physically, like, yeah, you're gonna have diarrhea. Does that make sense? Because all water will stay in the lumen, you're going to have watery diarrhea. Does that make sense? So water is absorbed by osmosis because it follows the sodium. Now, when water leaves the lumen of intestine, when it is absorbed from the lumen, what's going to happen to the concentration of other ions, like potassium, in that lumen? Yes, it goes up, right? Because you take water in, you make the solution, quote unquote solution, in the lumen more concentrated. So concentration of, say, potassium goes up, and because of this, potassium now can be absorbed. Does that make sense? So it's like step by step. Sodium gets first, pulls water. When you pull water out of the lumen, the concentration of ions in the lumen increases, and they diffuse into the cell. Well, it's all the same cells. Look, that's the problem. You have how many cells there? Picture 3. We have like 3 million cells there. So it all happens all the time, all in the same cell, in all 3 million cells. Does that make sense? It's a continuous process. Now, potassium, sodium, chloride goes the same way, because when sodium is absorbed, water is absorbed, chloride concentrations go up, chloride is absorbed because of the diffusion. Does that make sense? Cholera, you've heard cholera. Cholera blocks chloride absorption, and that pulls water back into the lumen, and you have diarrhea. Okay. Now, calcium. Calcium absorption is controlled. Okay. You can increase the amount of channels through which calcium goes from the lumen into the columnar cells. Does that make sense? Now, what would increase the number of channels? Low. Blood calcium is low. What is produced in response to low blood calcium? Which hormone? Parathyroid, PTH. PTH activates vitamin D. Vitamin D increases the number of channels and calcium absorption from intestine. Does that make sense? So calcium is absorbed when it is needed. And pretty much it's needed all the time, but especially in a time when it goes down, then its absorption increases. Does that make sense? Okay. Chloride. So when chloride is absorbed in the lumen, bicarbonate is secreted in the lumen. They have antiporter there. Now, the reason for that, excretion of bicarbonate, higher or lower, allows us to maintain acidity of the blood. Bicarbonate is basic, right? So when bicarbonate is excreted, blood becomes more acidic, so it allows to regulate acidity. Does that make sense? Iron is absorbed in the small intestine, and iron is absorbed always, but in the amounts that are needed. We cannot store iron effectively. Again, it's awful with that freaking physiology. You say something and it's not entirely true. What I'm saying is, we can't make the iron depositions that would last for the entire life. We do have iron depots, mostly in the liver. So say, if you have a blood loss, if you're a female and it's menses, if you're a male and you were just stabbed, okay, you lost some blood, to replenish for red blood cells, you need iron. Where do we take it from? The liver. How do we replenish it? We increase absorption of iron from the food. Does that make sense? Like iron deficient anemia, you can have it if you don't eat enough food rich in iron. Right? But you can eat like 5 pounds of liver every day and then stop right before, say, menses. Menses come, your iron's going to plunge. You can't, add more and more and more. You can't amount it. Does that make sense? So it's when needed. Okay. Pretty much, iron by itself is not available in the blood. It binds to the proteins that shuffle it through the blood to the liver. Okay. I believe one of the evolutionary reasons, we want to make it unavailable for microbes. Okay. Now, That's how much water enters the small intestine every day. 9 liters. Every day, 9 liters of water pass through the small intestine. Where do they come from? 9 liters of water. Where do they come from? We didn't drink all 9 liters. Huh? Well, not directly blood, because if there's blood in the intestine, we fucked up. But you're on the right track. So how much we eat and drink? Seriously. About 3 liters maybe. I mean, it depends, of course. We usually drink about 2.5, and then we get some with the food. Where else? No, I mean, which fluids get in there? Which fluids get in the digestive tract? I mean, we eat, we drink, huh? Well, mucus, okay, but mucus is, huh? I mean, which fluids do we produce in the digestive tract? Huh? Saliva, pancreatic juice, gastric juice, right? And we produce quite a lot. All of them end up in the digestive tract, right? And they all end up in the intestines. Does that make sense? But then, losing 9 liters of fluid every day seems like an awful waste. We lose enough through the skin, through the respiration. We would be pretty much bound to, we would be like fish bound to the river. Not swimming, but we still have enough dependence from water, so we want to conserve it. Almost all water that enters the intestine is reabsorbed. Okay, we lose about 100 milliliters in feces to make them softer. And if you ever got mildly dehydrated and then looked at the feces are really solid. Okay? Or if there's a constipation, feces come out, they're solid because there's so many rounds of water reabsorption. They stay in the large intestine for such a long time that more and more water is reabsorbed, so they become harder. Does that make sense? Malabsorption. Well, one case of malabsorption that I want to focus is celiac disease. Celiac disease is real. It's autoimmune disease in which people have a very site-specific allergy to the gluten that can be found in various types of grains, right? So gluten and the products of its breakdown cause local inflammation, okay, activate T cells, components of immune system, attack the lining of digestive tract, epithelial cells get destroyed, malabsorption. Does that make sense? Now, when I see gluten-free vodka, it makes me laugh, seriously. If you are a healthy person, gluten's fine. There are no studies suggesting that eating gluten-free food has any benefits. Seriously, it's just, I mean, I may give you other reasons to avoid muffins, okay, or white bread. I can give you other reasons, but it's definitely not gluten. Does that make sense? Okay. I will ask you about this idea of sodium diffuses because of the pump on the basal side, and then it pulls water because of the osmosis, and then concentrations of ions in lumen increase, and ions start to diffuse into the cells, like potassium. Okay? My favorite part. Love it. Because we can chat. We can have fiery chats. If you want, we can have fights over nutritional advice. You can see nutritional advices from CDC, I think, or USDA, whatever. So if you would look at the health eating pyramid, let's take a glance. What are these? Okay, let's first figure out energy-bearing nutrients, okay? Carbohydrates, lipids, and proteins, right? Non-energy-bearing nutrients, but still essential. Vitamins, minerals, and water. Do we agree on these 2 points? Okay, now let's examine the pyramid. This, potatoes and bread, what are they mostly? Carbs. Vegetables, what are they mostly? Carbs. Well, fiber is different to carbs. Fruits, what are they mostly? Carbs. Now we're going to switch to fat. This is fat, right? Oil is fat. Nuts, mostly fat actually. So rich in fat. Fat, right? Oh, I forgot another carbs here. Okay. And decent amount of fat over here. Okay, and then finally we have protein. Protein is this, right? Fish, poultry, meats, dairy, and legumes. Fairly equal amounts. Okay, although I have no clue. Well, when they say plant oils at most meals, obviously it doesn't. Question, David? What? Legume? It's beans, soy, any type of beans. Okay. Now, if you would look, obviously, when they say plant oils at most meals, I hope they don't expect us to drink like a glass of sunflower oil at every meal. So we talk not a lot of fat here. You just kind of have to eat it a little, right? So according to this pyramid, your diet should be mostly carbohydrate based. Yeah, we talk quality carbohydrates coming from fruits, vegetables, whole grains. What else do we have? Complex carbs like potatoes. Okay. A little bit of protein and just a tad of fat. Seriously. No meat. Just a little bit of butter. Dairy is very limited. Now this is more modern here. Okay. But again, if you look at this, that's mostly carbohydrates. A little bit of protein and a little bit of fat. So essentially, for a very long time, USDA and CDC and FDA, whatever, they suggested that we need to eat the high carbohydrate, low fat foods. Go to any grocery store. I cannot find a freaking normal yogurt. They're all non-fat or low fat. It's disappointing. And one thing, I never paid attention to it unless my friend told me that. Have you seen fat-free half and a half? Well, it's either half and a half or it's fat-free, but not both things together. I mean, it just can't happen. So everything seems to be fat-free. Now, imagine that you have now a food which contains proteins, fats, and carbohydrates. And you remove fat from it. What's going to happen to carbohydrate content in terms of percentage? It goes up. Now, if you have a normal yogurt and fat-free yogurt, are you going to eat different amounts? Probably not. It's going to be the same cup. But in case of fat-free, you will eat way more carbs. Does that make sense? So, fat-free diet or low-fat diet increases the carbohydrate consumption. And the hopes that low-fat diet will drive down the obesity epidemics in the United States were quite an opposite. It actually drove it up. Okay? Not only this, I don't want to blame like non-fat yogurts on Americans becoming bigger and bigger. Okay, it's more to this, but definitely the advice, oh, don't eat fats, was wrong. Okay, the problem with nutrition is that the nutritional advice, is very controversial. Look at this. Two papers from the same guy. So this dude in 1997 suggested that dietary saturated fat increases the risk of CVD. Then he corrected himself, saying that it's probably the ratio between unsaturated and saturated fat. Where are we going to find unsaturated fat? Bless you. Unsaturated. Fish, plant oils. Saturated. Is butter, meats. It's not bad stuff. It's great stuff. I love this. Okay, but it's been blamed for cardiovascular disease. Well, the later studies suggest that saturated fat in the diet is not associated with increased risk for cardiovascular disease. So you can drink milk, eat butter. Of course, I'm not saying like holding a stick and biting off the stick. Did you see movie Butter? There's a movie called Butter. It's about butter sculptures in Iowa. Absolutely ridiculous movie. It's just super ridiculous. How they make it's a somebody suggested we watch it, and we watched it, and luckily for that person, I don't remember who suggested it. I mean, it's kind of funny, but we wasted like 2 hours of our lives. Now, going back to nutritional advice. So currently, low-fat diet is being debated, and even FDA or USDA or whoever it is, they said, we probably were wrong. We screwed up. Because if you would look some studies, so I looked up some of them, especially on low carbohydrate diet. Okay, low carb diets are equal or better in terms of the weight control as low fat. Does that make sense? Now, this is one of the statements. Low carb non-energy restricted diets are equally as good as the low fat energy restricted. What does that mean? All these fancy words. Yeah, so when you eat low fat diet, you have to count calories. When you eat low carb, you don't really have to. Well, unless you plan to kind of eat 2 pounds of bacon, a can of nuts, and 2 sticks of butter every day. That's a totally different story. Okay, you're probably going to be dead in a few months, but that's a different story. You don't have to count calories. And in couple of classes, you will see how it happens. Okay? So, same efficiency, more effective at 6 months. Okay? The downside changes in the values of low density versus high density lipoproteins. So what it means, you've heard about bad cholesterol and good cholesterol. So you better have more good and less bad. It's kind of obvious. Turns out that diets that are low in carbohydrates may kind of skew it a little bit towards bad cholesterol. But let me tell you something. The major contributor to the bad cholesterol, what we call bad cholesterol, is trans fats. We're going to find trans fats. Which oil? Not oil, not, huh? No, canola is perfect. Canola is great. No, it's good. Yeah, margarine, vegetable shortening, Crisco, all that stuff. This is awful. And whether you put margarine or Crisco, bake when you bake. So you eat sweets, especially the industrial baking, like you buy cookies and stuff like that. You can have it. So that what contributes mostly to the bad cholesterol. Okay. So well, obviously, the more compliant you are to the diet, the better. So taking, if we will try to get it all together, first of all, the idea to ditch proteins and fats, especially fats, is bad. The idea to ditch carbohydrates does seem more reasonable. The problem with any type of nutritional study is that, first, people are people, they're non-compliant. Second, it's really hard to enroll people because they have to track down what they eat. They have to report physical activity. They have to report whether they're drinking, smoking, blah, blah, blah. People are heterogeneous. He's young, he's old, he's big, he's tiny. I don't know. He does have the underlying condition. He doesn't, and so on and so forth. So it's not mice. They're really, really different. It's really hard to keep them in the loop for a long time. There's one study, actually, so-called Framingham study. There's a city of Framingham in Massachusetts. It's rather small. So Framingham study tracks down the inhabitants of the city for like 40 years now. I mean, they do periodic checkups, they do all the blood work, they do it on the parents and the kids. So actually, Framingham study suggested that there is no link between the saturated fats and cardiovascular disease. Okay, so the kind of a nutshell, eat bacon. Well, bacon is kind of, well, meat, dairy, butter. It's okay. It's not bad, unless, again, eat the entire stick. Now, about the nutritional studies, one example that I give. In one of the big research centers on obesity is located in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Where else? Bennington Biomedical Research Center. And they have done a study in which it was a very simple study. They recruited young, healthy students from Louisiana State University in Baton Rouge for 1 month. For 1 month, students had to eat 4,000 calories a day. And I can do that. Not a problem. I love nuts. 4,000 calories? Well, be my guest. I can do that. In some cases, when I like during days off, when I train, oh, easily. So 4,000 calories, but they had no limits on training, any athletic activities. Doesn't really matter. They didn't track this. And they could eat anything extra if they wanted to. But the regular meals were administered at the research facility. And at a certain point, they had to put the nurse in that room because they just didn't finish. So there was a nurse, like a policeman, standing next to them. They didn't let him out until they finished the meal. So you have to you have potato, and it was decent meal, like potatoes and, I don't know, the beef stew, okay? But portions were considerable, right? As the reward, students got the 3 or 4 months free membership in some fancy gym. During the study, some students dropped out, okay? When study was over, most of the students said, never contact me again, probably because it was the worst experience of their lives. The amount of fat, amount of extra weight that they accumulated varied from as little as like 3 to 4 pounds, Some couple of people gained 20 pounds over the span of a month. But the funny thing, they looked at different molecular markers. Inflammation, dysfunction, and so on. Nothing changed. On the molecular level, they all stayed healthy. They probably lost that weight over the period. So it's not only how much you eat, it's what you eat, and how long do you maintain that extra weight. Does that make sense? It's pretty interesting. And you know, the tail when this lady, this professor, she was telling us about the setup and the study, we were, okay, what's the outcome? Nothing changed. Oh crap. Now, carbs. We talked about the digestion. You have starches, used mostly starches. Lactose, right? Break down those sugars like lactose, sucrose, starches broke down to monosaccharides, glucose, fructose, galactose. Fructose can be converted to glucose in the liver or can be directly used for the synthesis of glycogen and triglycerides. Galactose is converted in the liver to glucose. Glucose is obviously the first step in aerobic respiration, the ATP production. Now, fructose, it turns out, so when you eat fructose, it doesn't stimulate the release of leptin. So there's no satiety signal. And that may, in turn, stimulate the development of, fancy word, non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, which means fatty liver disease. Okay? Decrease the insulin sensitivity and lead to the weight gain. So fructose is not a safe alternative. Sugar. Okay? What else can we use? Carbohydrates. Synthesis of nucleic acids. And they're also used for the glycosylation of proteins and lipids. Now, there's no exact clinical threshold of what is low carbohydrate, high carbohydrate diet. Generally, it is considered that high carb is 225 to 300 grams of carbohydrates per day. We talk about 2,000 calories diet, standard, 2,000 calories a day diet. Low, 50 to 150. So if you think about this, if 1 gram of carbohydrates give you 4 calories, 50 grams will give you 200. So it's 10% daily consumption of calories from carbs. It's really, really low. I can't possibly fathom anything like that for myself, mostly because of beer. It's really carb rich. Of course, complex carbs are better. Okay, when we say complex, I mean potato, okay, whole grains, beans, both proteins and carbohydrates. Now, processed foods, bread, pizza, they contain sweets. They contain a lot of simple carbs. The simplest one would be sucrose. There's not a lot of energy spent on the digestion. They're pretty simple to digest. And also, sweetness makes them tastier. So that means food is more palatable. Admit it. Pizza is better than green beans. Come on. Well, if you make pizza the right way, you will eat it together with your fingers, right? No, I mean, well, for you maybe, but for general population, if you put green beans in pizza, come on, I've got to call my kids at home by themselves. Got a call from them. They have a fridge full of good, healthy, nutritious food. Dad, can we order pizza? So it's better. No argument. Because it's palatable. Okay, they almost sprinkle it with monosodium glutamate, or an MSG, which is absolutely fine It bears no danger to your organism. It's the amino acid that you have, glutamate. The only problem is that it makes everything tastier. If I'll sprinkle it on the nails, you would eat nails, okay, because they will taste good. That makes sense? So when you have MSG in the food, you're going to eat a ton of it because it tastes so awesome. That makes sense? Now, this is kind of a recommended caloric intake, 45 to 65%, which is, again, as we just discussed, debatable. Okay? Obviously, if you overindulge on carbs, it's obesity. If you underindulge, if you're really curious what's going to happen, and we get into the molecular mechanisms of it. Did anyone do a low-carb diet ever? Really low carb, no? Oh yeah. Oh yeah, yeah. You eat. I did that, and in the evening I allowed myself a little piece of chocolate. I don't know what people who shoot heroin feel. I think it's comparable. I was like high. Okay. So, how did you feel physically? Yes. You're tired. You're always tired, physically tired. So your endurance is in the toilet. Your strength is normal, absolutely normal. But endurance is gone, stamina is gone. You're constantly tired. But interestingly enough, if you go really low carb, eventually get used to it. You go in the state of ketosis, and your body starts using other energy sources, not carbohydrates. And there are marathoners and ultra marathoners that do not eat carbs at all. So they are in constant state of ketosis, but they're not tired because they're used to it. The advantage on the distance, they don't have to eat anything. They produce whatever. They don't have to eat carbs like regular folks. They eat like gels or pretzels or something else during the marathon. These guys don't have to do that. So it's pretty neat. Fats. That's the last thing that we're going to chat about. Proteins later. Fats, saturated. Meat and dairy. Animal fats are saturated. Okay? Unsaturated. Plant fats from seeds, okay, and from fish. It's also unsaturated. Trans fats. Bad for you. We're going to talk about how they are bad for you. Now they actually, in Europe, some countries, they require that food does not contain trans fats at all. Okay? Cholesterol is another fat. Egg yolk contains a lot of cholesterol, which we'll also talk about. It's fine. You can eat eggs. Why? You don't like it? Okay. You can eat chicken. It's pretty much the same egg, just developed, right? Some of the fatty acids are essential for synthesis of hormones, components of the molecules like lecithin, like linoleic acid. So essential fatty acids can be found in the plant oils. Okay, energy. Fat does provide energy, and a lot of energy. It's extremely efficient. Glucose gives 4. Fat, I think like 6 calories per gram or something. Fat is better as the energy source. Okay, that's why we probably use it as a storage of energy. Adipose tissue provides you some reserve in case hunger strikes. Absorption of fat-soluble vitamins. There is a reason they are called fat-soluble. Like probably your mom told you that there's a lot of vitamin A in carrots. Well, if you just eat carrots, only a small portion of it, of the vitamin A, will be absorbed. But if you mix carrots with a fat, like oil or dairy, some sour cream, which also contains a lot of fat, then the absorption will be better. Okay. Integrity of the plasma membranes depends on fats, phospholipids, and metabolites of arachidonic acid, such as prostacyclins and prostaglandins and thromboxane, are responsible for the inflammation, the regulation of inflammation, the contraction of the smooth muscles, the blood flow. So metabolites of fat are necessary for that type of hormonal control. Now, FDA recommends 30% of daily caloric intake, saturated at 10, cholesterol less than 300. Those are recommendations that are contradicted by the modern dietary studies. It does not have to be that low, and there appear to be no long-term effects of the higher fat consumption, if it's what I would call a quality fat. Okay, so that's what I give here. These numbers may be reconsidered. Excess of fat. Now, you have to appreciate what is excess. Focus mostly on the excess of calories. And if I'm going to eat, as I mentioned, 2 sticks of butter, a can of nuts, and consume like 5,000 calories a day, yeah, it's all fat, no carbs, but I'm still going to gain weight. Just because of the amount of calories that I take in. If I don't spend them, then I'm going to get big. Okay? Some of the fatty acids are essential, and you can see that's bullshit. Sorry. Vegetable shortening is not an essential fatty acid. That's complete baloney. Now, fat is important for the absorption of vitamins, so the lack of it may deprive the skin from vitamin A, which regulates healthy skin and affect growth and stuff like that. Lack of fat in the diet. Again, we talk about starvation. I mean, if you go on totally carbohydrate diet, like you're going to eat sugar and pizza, then you're not going to starve to death. Quite an opposite. You're not going to lose any weight. Don't expect. You're going to gain a considerable amount of it. Okay? So, what I try to convey here is that nutritional advice isn't as straightforward as it was presented for a long time. You know, ditch carbs, ditch fats, and you're going to lose fat. No. Okay? Ditch carbs and eat as much fat as you want, and you're going to lose weight. Not really now. Does that make sense? I'm going to stop at this point.